today, Ian, we're going to talk about guarantors, that often misunderstood element of an application process or tenancy process. Who needs one and what are they legally responsible for? Welcome to the All Things Property podcast with me, Simon Bacon of Preferential Properties. Every week, Ian Sadler and I will delve into all things property. We'll guide you through with friendly, no-nonsense advice. Welcome to the All Things Property podcast with me, Simon Bacon.
And me, Ian Sadler.
So, I think sometimes most guarantors sign the paperwork thinking that they are just going to be a backup, but in reality, they can be fully responsible for the tenancy. So Ian, in terms of a guarantor, for those that don't know, what is a guarantor on a tenancy?
Well, the best way to describe a guarantor is, if you like, a co-tenant. They accept and sign for all the responsibilities the tenant signs for, rent, utility bills, obligations throughout the tenancy.
All encompassing then?
Pretty much.
Yeah. Do you think guarantors understand that when they sign up?
I think a guarantor is more likely to understand the implications of a guarantor's agreement because it's a shorter document, easy to read. It's not a 7 or 8 page document that we've agreed already. Tenants quite often don't fully read. So, and I find if they have any queries after reading that, there's a quick phone call or an email, just clarifying the situation. Yeah, the length of liabilities, a moot point, which we'll get onto.
We'll get onto that in a minute. So, who can act as a guarantor? What's the general criteria for someone to be a guarantor?
Well, it's based on affordability. I think our referencing process is based initially on credit searches and affordability. It's which is a more stringent check than it used to be. It's based on salary less ongoing expenditure.
It's funny the way things have changed. I think many years ago, probably when you and I were first starting out in the rental sector, a guarantor was often my great-grandmother, because she'll make sure that I pay my rent on time, not realising that actually they're actually liable for the rent. In terms of joint and individual liability, what's a guarantor actually responsible for? So if there are 2 tenants and would you have one guarantor or would you have 2 guarantors? How would that work?
Well, my understanding of it, and you might want to correct me, is that tenant responsibilities are joint and several. So if one defaults on the rent payment, then the other person has to pay. So if a guarantor is only how can a guarantor stand as a guarantor for just half of the rent? It has to be for the whole lot.
Okay, but if you're referencing a guarantor for a 50% share of the rent, then the guarantor is only liable for 50% of the costs, because the guarantor stands behind an individual tenant. So my understanding is on a joint tenant, it's joint and severable, so you can go against both the tenants, but the guarantor is only standing behind the one individual tenant.
So the landlord would lose 50% of the rent owed?
I think my understanding is that you'd probably end up pursuing the guarantor for 50% of the costs.
I think my guarantor agreement, maybe wrong, guarantees the tenancy.
Yeah. So again, I think one of the takeaways from this is check what the guarantor is liable for. Are they liable for both, or are they just liable for the share of any costs attributable to the person that they are guaranteeing? So in terms of duration of liability then, Ian, what's the situation on that one? Because in the old regime we had, a guarantor was responsible for a fixed period of time, the fixed term of the tenancy, and if that tenancy then rolled on to a periodic tenant, then the guarantor, their liability stops at that point, didn't it?
Yes.
Be interesting to see, and because we're so new into the new regulations, I'm not sure yet as to whether or not that's been tested, because it's not a fixed term tenancy, my assumption will be that the guarantor
lifespan of it.
Lifespan of them being in occupation.
No, I think so.
That's
It'll be
how I
tested
would understand. No, it hasn't
in
been
law
tested
somewhere, but it hasn't happened
I think
yet.
for me, lots of these changes that have taken place under the Renters' Rights Act, until they get challenged, I think that's when there will be further clarity and further changes. So it feels like...
Well, it needs not to be an interpretation. This is why I would stress making your tenancy agreements and your guarantor agreements relative to the new Act.
Absolutely. No, definitely. So is there a risk for landlords in terms of relying on weak guarantors, do you think? Or
what do you mean by weaker guarantor?
I don't know. If you've got a guarantor that is not financially secure, or because I suppose one of the issues is that how many guarantors would be able to meet the obligations of the rent if the tenant...
Well, they're referenced on the same basis as the tenant. In principle, they're treated as a co-tenant. They go through exactly the same referencing process as the tenant as the property does. So if they can't afford it, they won't pass. And then,
but if you think about it, you're referencing a tenant on a rent share, aren't you? So let's say the rent's £1,000. The tenant is going to be, let's say one tenant, the tenant is going to be paying their £1,000. So affordability works because they're not paying another rent somewhere else, they're paying a rent. Whereas if you have a guarantor, they're being assessed for affordability against the rent, but it's not a credit search as in, how many loans have they got, or are they a mortgage payer? Because how many guarantors would not be paying a rent or a mortgage?
Well, aren't they assessed basically on their outgoings and expenditure?
No, they're based. The guarantor just looks at what their income is. It's not on. They don't have to divulge if they've got a mortgage and what their mortgage payments are. And I think for me, that's one of those areas that, again, from a landlord's perspective, yes, the guarantor works because it's someone else to have sitting behind the financial risk liability, but ultimately, how effective is a guarantor? Have you ever had to speak to a guarantor because the rent hasn't been paid?
No.
No.
Lucky me.
You are. I mean, I've had a couple and they've stepped up, but it does raise a question of what you look for in a guarantor, and making sure the guarantor really does understand what they're signing up for. So I suppose to bring this episode to an end, what we're really saying here is a guarantor isn't a formality. Anybody who becomes a guarantor, it's a serious legal commitment that needs to be properly understood. And again, what I would say, communication, making sure the guarantor understands what it is that they're signing up for is probably crucial. Thank you. Thanks for tuning in to this week's episode of the All Things Property podcast. If you found this episode useful, don't forget to subscribe, like and share. These things really help us reach the people who need to hear this advice. See you next week.